A mysterious rancher watched the sheriff abandon her, then made an offer that saved her life. But why was he really there that day? And what did he know? The knock came at dawn, sharp and unforgiving. Sheriff Martinez stood on Emma's porch, hat in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry to tell you this, but your husband Thomas, he's gone." Gone. Such a simple word for something that changes everything. Thomas had ridden out to check the north pasture just yesterday morning. Strong as an ox, barely 32 years old. Now the sheriff was telling her he'd found him face down by the creek, horse grazing nearby like nothing had happened. Heart gave out, looks like, Martinez said, already backing toward his horse. Sent the body to Murphy's. You'll need to settle up with him directly. That was it. No offer to help contact family, no mention of what happens next. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Emma standing there with her hand resting on her barely swollen belly. 4 months along, just starting to show if you knew where to look. The 1890s weren't exactly the golden age of social services. Frontier towns operated on a simple principle. You took care of your own problems, or your problems took care of you. Widows fell into a particularly tough category. They weren't quite family anymore, but they weren't independent citizens either. Makes sense, right? Women couldn't even vote yet. Emma walked back inside, the silence hitting her like a physical thing. Yesterday morning, Thomas had been complaining about the coffee being too weak. Now she'd give anything to hear him grumble about breakfast again. The house felt enormous and tiny all at once. But here's the thing about frontier life. It didn't pause for grief. The cattle still needed water. The chickens still needed feeding. Bills still needed paying. And Emma was about to discover just how quickly a woman's world could collapse when the man holding it up disappeared. The drought had been brutal that summer. Wells ran dry across 3 counties. Cattle prices dropped so low that some ranchers just abandoned their herds rather than pay to feed them through winter. Even the successful spreads were barely scraping by. Thomas had mentioned money troubles, but Emma figured it was just the usual worrying. Every rancher complained about money. Well, she was about to learn the difference between complaining about money and actually not having any. The undertaker's bill would come first, then the feed store. The banknote was due in 6 weeks. Emma had helped with the books sometimes, but Thomas handled the serious business dealings. She knew enough to be worried, but not enough to know exactly how worried she should be. Morning turned to afternoon as neighbors, who should have come to pay respect, stayed mysteriously busy with their own affairs. All word travels fast in small towns, and apparently word was that the widow might be more trouble than sympathy could fix. Emma had no idea that within days, she'd understand exactly why that knock on her door would change everything about her life, and not in ways she could have imagined. The sheriff's boots disappeared down the dusty path, leaving behind nothing but silence and the weight of terrible news. She stood there on her porch, one hand instinctively moving to her belly, where new life grew beneath her worn cotton dress. Off. The ranch stretched out before her like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Wind swept across the empty corrals with a lonesome whistle. Her husband's cattle, well, her cattle now had dwindled to maybe 30 head. Drought had been merciless that summer. The creek ran so low you could step across it without getting your ankles wet. Makes sense why he'd been so worried about money lately, right? But worry wouldn't feed the remaining livestock, or fix the sagging fence posts. Every morning brought the same brutal routine. She'd haul water from the well, her growing belly making each bucket feel twice as heavy. The chickens still needed grain. The few remaining cows still wandered toward the barn at milking time, bawling complaints when she arrived late. Her back ached something fierce by noon, and sunset felt like a distant dream. Then there was the matter of her neighbors. The Hendersons lived just 2 miles east, close enough to smell their chimney smoke on calm evenings. Before her husband died, Martha Henderson would wave from her wagon, and sometimes bring over fresh bread. Now, nothing. The woman looked right through her at church last Sunday, like she'd become invisible. Word travels fast in small towns, especially bad word. Folks whispered about unpaid debts and overdue mortgage payments. Nobody wanted to get too close to financial trouble. It might be catching. Well, maybe that's harsh, but you can't blame people for protecting their own families when times get tough. The general store owner had started asking for cash up front instead of putting purchases on account. The feed supplier hemmed and hawed about extending credit for winter hay. Even the preacher's wife offered only thin smiles and thinner comfort. Here's the brutal truth. Nobody talks about most widows lost everything within 12 months. The land, the livestock, sometimes even their children if they couldn't provide proper care. Banks didn't care much about sob stories when mortgage payments came due. Creditors showed up with legal papers and zero sympathy. She'd heard about widow auctions in neighboring counties, desperate women selling everything they owned just to buy passage somewhere else. Some sold themselves into work contracts that barely qualified as freedom. The lucky ones had family back east willing to take them in, but she had nobody. No parents, no siblings, no rich relatives waiting with open arms. Standing on that porch as another sunset painted the sky orange and purple, she pressed both hands against her belly. The baby kicked, strong little fighter already. Her husband always said this land had good bones, that it just needed someone stubborn enough to make it work. Problem was, being stubborn doesn't pay mortgages, and the folks in town were about to make that crystal clear. The morning after she buried her husband, Martha walked into town with her chin up and her shoulders back. Bad mistake. The whispers started before she even reached the general store. That woman thinks she can handle a ranch. Old Mrs. Henderson practically shouted it to her friend. My Henry says she don't know a bull from a steer. Well, Henry was wrong about a lot of things, but facts didn't matter much in a place where gossip traveled faster than wildfire. The real trouble started at Miller's bank. Martha needed to discuss the mortgage payments. Nothing dramatic, just a conversation about timing. But when she walked through those heavy wooden doors, you'd think she was asking to rob the place. Mrs. Campbell, banker Miller said, not bothering to stand up. I'm concerned about your situation. Situation. Like being widowed was some kind of disease she'd caught. The ranch is profitable, she told him. The cattle are healthy, and we've got good grazing land. Miller shuffled papers on his desk, making a show of looking busy. Ma'am, with all due respect, managing livestock isn't women's work. These are complex business decisions. Complex business decisions. Martha had been keeping the ranch books for 3 years while her husband focused on the cattle. But try explaining that to a man who thought women couldn't count past 10 without losing track. The banker leaned back in his leather chair. I've seen this before. Widows get overwhelmed, fall behind on payments. Then we're forced to foreclose. Forced, right, like the bank was doing her some kind of favor. Martha knew the numbers that Miller was dancing around. In 1890s Texas, less than 10% of ranch owners were women. Not because women couldn't do the work, but because men like Miller made sure they didn't get the chance. Then there was the matter of the upcoming auction. Every Tuesday, the town held sales for struggling families. Furniture, tools, livestock, whatever people needed to sell to survive. But Martha noticed something else getting sold. The labor contracts of women who couldn't pay their debts. I'll give you until month's end, Miller said, like he was being generous. After that, well, we'll see what options remain. Walking home, Martha passed the weekly auction. A young mother stood on the platform while men bid on her services. The auctioneer called out prices like she was a piece of farm equipment. The woman's eyes stayed fixed on the ground, her face burning with shame. Makes sense now why Miller seemed so confident about her situation, right? But the weird part is what happened next. While Martha watched this humiliating spectacle, a stranger rode into town. His wagon had a broken wheel, and he looked frustrated about the delay. This rancher, tall, weathered, with kind eyes, dismounted and surveyed the crowd. Little did Martha know, this random breakdown would change everything about her impossible situation. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with official seals that might as well have been death certificates. 3 months behind on payments was all it took. The banker didn't even have the decency to deliver it personally, just sent his clerk with papers that stripped away everything she'd called home. Within 2 weeks, strangers were walking through her house. They poked at her furniture, examined her husband's tools, and discussed the value of her kitchen table like she wasn't even there. The sheriff supervised the whole process, making sure every last possession got catalogued for sale. Not once did he ask if she had anywhere to go. The day they locked the doors, she stood in the yard with nothing but a worn leather suitcase and the clothes on her back. Her belly had grown rounder, making her condition impossible to hide. The baby kicked as if protesting this sudden homelessness, and she pressed her hand against her side, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Walking into town felt like a death march. Every step reminded her that she was now one of those women, the kind people whispered about and crossed the street to avoid. Pregnant, alone, and broke. The trifecta of frontier failure, The local boarding house had a no vacancy sign that appeared mighty convenient timing. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the place, barely opened the door before shaking her head. "Can't take in someone in your condition," she said, eyeing the growing belly. "What if something happens? I'm not running a charity hospital." Then there was the church. Surely they'd have compassion for a widow in need. Well, the pastor's wife explained that their spare room was already occupied by a traveling preacher. Funny how that preacher never seemed to leave town, yet no one had seen hide nor hair of him. Night fell faster than her hopes. She found herself sitting on a bench outside the general store, watching families head home to warm dinners and soft beds. The irony wasn't lost on her. 12 hours ago, she'd owned hundreds of acres. Now she couldn't claim ownership of the wooden slats beneath her. The storekeeper emerged to lock up and found her still sitting there. "Can't stay here all night, ma'am," he said, not unkindly but firm. "Sheriff makes his rounds and he don't like loiterers." Makes sense, right? The same sheriff who'd done nothing to help her was now a threat to her basic existence. She spent that first night walking the empty streets, her suitcase growing heavier with each step. The baby seemed restless too, as if sensing their desperate situation. Every shadow held potential danger. Every sound made her jump. Morning brought rumors of something happening at the town square. People were gathering for what looked like an auction, but the whispered conversations suggested this wasn't about selling cattle or farm equipment. What she discovered there would change everything, but first she had to survive the night. Life has this twisted way of putting people exactly where they need to be, at the worst possible moment. Take wagon wheels for instance. They break when you least expect it, forcing you into situations you never planned for. That's exactly what happened to Jake Morrison on a dusty Tuesday morning. His wagon wheel cracked right outside the town limits, leaving him stranded with a load of supplies and nowhere to go. Bad luck? Maybe, but sometimes bad luck creates the most important moments of your life. Jake limped his wagon into town, muttering curses at the broken wheel and the delay it would cause. He needed parts from the blacksmith, which meant staying overnight. The last thing he wanted was to spend time in a place where gossip spread faster than wildfire, and everyone minded everyone else's business except their own. But as he walked toward the blacksmith shop, something caught his attention. A crowd had gathered in the town square, and not the friendly kind. This was the sort of gathering that made your stomach turn, people circling like vultures around fresh meat. An auction was taking place. Not for cattle or land, mind you, for people. There, standing on a makeshift platform, was a young woman holding the hand of a small girl. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, describing her qualities like she was livestock. Strong back, good with children, willing worker. The crowd murmured and pointed, some laughing at crude jokes that made Jake's jaw clench. The woman stood perfectly still, her chin raised despite everything happening around her. She wasn't crying or begging. Instead, she stared straight ahead with a dignity that shouldn't have been possible in such circumstances. Her dress was worn but clean, and her pregnant belly was just starting to show beneath the faded fabric. Jake had seen enough auctions to know desperation when he saw it. But this wasn't just desperation. This was someone fighting to keep their soul intact while the world tried to strip it away. The little girl beside her couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She clung to her mother's skirt, wide eyes taking in the crowd with confusion and fear. Every few seconds the woman would squeeze the child's hand, a small gesture that somehow made the entire scene both heartbreaking and infuriating. "What's her story?" Jake asked a man standing nearby. "Widow, lost her ranch last month. Sheriff says she owes debts all over town." The man shrugged like it was nothing special. "Happens all the time. Can't pay, can't stay." Jake watched as bidders raised their hands, each offer reducing this woman's future to cold numbers. $20, $25. 30. The prices people put on human dignity were disturbingly low. Something about her refusal to break down stirred memories Jake had tried to forget. His own wife's face flashed through his mind. The same stubborn strength, the same quiet determination. The bidding continued, but Jake's decision was already made. Sometimes a broken wagon wheel leads you exactly where you need to be, and sometimes, being in the right place means stepping into someone else's nightmare to help them find their way out. Standing at that auction block, watching desperate people bid on a pregnant widow like she was livestock, something shifted inside the rancher. He'd seen plenty of cruel things on the frontier, but this crossed a line he didn't know existed until that moment. The bidding started low. Too low. A few local men threw out numbers like they were buying a workhorse, not offering refuge to a human being carrying a child. The widow stood perfectly still, chin raised, refusing to let them see her break. Her small daughter clutched her skirt, eyes wide with confusion. Then the rancher did something that shocked everyone in that dusty town square. He called out a number that was triple the highest bid. The crowd went silent. Even the auctioneer stumbled over his words. Nobody paid that much for a widow's labor contract, especially not for someone who was months away from childbirth. Makes sense, right? From a business angle, it was financial suicide. But here's what the townspeople didn't understand about this particular rancher. 3 years earlier, consumption had taken his wife during a harsh winter. He'd held her hand as she died, promising he'd never forget what real love looked like. Standing there watching another woman face impossible odds alone brought back every painful memory of helplessness he'd carried since. The other bidders backed down fast. Who argues with a man willing to pay premium prices for basic human decency? As money changed hands, whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some called him foolish. Others wondered if he'd lost his mind to grief. A few suggested he was planning something inappropriate. Small towns love their gossip, especially when it involves unusual kindness. Well, let them talk. The rancher approached the widow after the paperwork was signed. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice stayed steady when she thanked him. He noticed she didn't ask what he expected in return. Smart woman, she understood frontier survival meant accepting help first and sorting out details later. My ranch is 2 days' ride north, he told her quietly. You and your daughter can have the small cabin by the creek. No conditions attached. The weird part is how naturally those words came out. He'd been planning to hire seasonal help anyway. Having someone reliable around made practical sense, pregnant or not. Her daughter tugged on his coat sleeve and asked if his ranch had chickens. When he nodded, she smiled for the first time since the auction started. Sometimes children see hope where adults only see problems. As they prepared to leave town, the rancher loaded their few belongings into his wagon. The widow climbed up carefully, protecting her growing belly. Her daughter settled between them, already chattering about chickens and maybe seeing a real cow up close. But what none of them realized was that this simple act of compassion would soon uncover secrets about her husband's death that certain powerful people desperately wanted buried forever. Life on the rancher's property started before sunrise every morning. She'd wake up to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and coffee brewing in the kitchen. Her small daughter would still be sleeping in the corner room they'd been given, the first real beds either of them had seen in months. The rancher, true to his word, expected nothing from her except what she could give, but she wasn't the type to sit idle while others worked around her. Show me what needs doing, she told him that first week. Well, rancher work wasn't exactly what most pregnant women signed up for, but frontier life had already taught her that survival meant adapting fast. The rancher started her with simple tasks: feeding chickens, collecting eggs, mending torn fence wire. Nothing too heavy, nothing that would put the baby at risk. Her daughter thrived in ways that surprised everyone. The ranch hands, mostly older men who'd worked the land for decades, took to the little girl immediately. They taught her to recognize different cattle brands and showed her which plants were safe to touch. For the first time in months, the child laughed regularly. Then there's the matter of learning cattle work itself. Makes sense that a woman who'd watched her husband manage livestock would pick up the basics quickly, right? The rancher discovered she had a natural eye for spotting sick animals. She could tell when a cow was favoring one leg, or when the herd seemed restless before bad weather hit. Most folks take years to notice what you're seeing in weeks, he told her one evening. The physical work actually helped her pregnancy progress better than anyone expected. Regular meals, steady sleep, and purposeful activity replaced the stress and uncertainty that had plagued her for months. The baby seemed to respond to the stability. Her movements became stronger, more regular, but the real change happened around the dinner table each night. Ranch hands would share stories from their day, discuss plans for moving cattle to different pastures, debate the best time to plant winter feed. She found herself contributing ideas, asking questions that made the experienced workers think differently about familiar problems. Her daughter would fall asleep listening to these conversations, curled up against her mother's growing belly. The rancher began including her in decisions that went beyond daily chores. When should they sell the young steers? Which fields needed rest from grazing? How many supplies should they order for winter? Her practical mind, sharpened by months of desperate survival, proved valuable in ways none of them had anticipated. Local townspeople occasionally rode out to conduct business with the rancher. They'd see her working alongside the men, clearly pregnant, obviously competent. Some whispered disapproval, others nodded with grudging respect. "That woman's got more sand than most men I know," one cattle buyer remarked after watching her help sort a difficult herd. Winter approached with the ranch running more smoothly than it had in years, but something else was brewing beneath this peaceful surface. Questions about her husband's death that wouldn't stay buried, no matter how comfortable her new life became. The truth hit her like a lightning bolt on a clear day. Her husband hadn't died in some freak accident. He'd been murdered. Makes sense why the sheriff was so quick to ship the body off to the undertaker, right? No investigation, no questions asked. Just a convenient story about a tragic mishap. She'd been going through old papers in the rancher's study when she found it. A letter her husband had written but never sent, detailing threats he'd received from local cattle barons who wanted his land. Well, turns out they got it anyway, just not the way they'd planned. The sheriff's signature appeared on several suspicious documents transferring property rights. Funny how that works when you're in someone's pocket. The rancher believed her immediately. He'd suspected something wasn't right about the whole situation from the start. Together they dug deeper into the corruption that ran through their small town like poison through a well. The sheriff wasn't just looking the other way, he was actively helping wealthy ranchers steal land from struggling families. Her husband had stumbled onto their scheme, and that made him dangerous. But fighting back meant putting everything at risk again. The same people who'd destroyed her life once wouldn't hesitate to do it again, and the weird part is, she wasn't scared anymore. Losing everything had taught her something the comfortable life never could. She was tougher than she'd ever imagined. The rancher stood by her side when she marched into the sheriff's office with evidence. Death threats started arriving within days. Someone shot at their ranch house windows. Local businesses refused to serve them. The whole town seemed to turn against anyone who dared challenge the established order. Then there is the small matter of her being a pregnant widow, not exactly the typical profile of someone taking on corrupt officials. Let's not forget how unusual this was for the frontier. Women didn't typically lead fights for justice, especially against powerful men, but she'd already lost everything once. What more could they take from her? The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, witness testimonies from other intimidated ranchers. The sheriff had been running a systematic operation to force families off their land through manufactured debts and suspicious accidents. Her husband's murder was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. When the territorial authorities finally arrived, they found a web of corruption that stretched far beyond one small town. The sheriff was arrested along with 3 prominent cattle barons. Justice moved slowly on the frontier, but it moved. Her victory changed everything. The territorial government passed new protections for widows and small ranchers. Other women began speaking up about their own losses and suspicious circumstances. She'd become something she never expected, a symbol of frontier strength and determination. The rancher watched her transform from a desperate woman at an auction into a respected leader in their community. But even as justice was served and new laws were written, another challenge was approaching that would test everything they'd built together.